Welcome to our Third Thursday program series. Hi, I'm Jerry Flegel, President and CEO of the Hoover Presidential Foundation, and we're glad that you're here with us today. Our partners for the Third Thursday program are the Hoover Presidential Library Museum, the Hoover Historic Site, West Branch Public Library, and of course the Hoover Presidential Foundation. Today's speaker is Craig Wright. Craig is the supervising archivist at the Hoover Presidential Library Museum, and Craig's talk will be Travels with Dad, Lou's 1921 cross-country trip. Craig?
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Jerry. I'm going to talk to, thanks for everyone for tuning in and checking out this video. I'm here today to talk about Lou Henry Hoover, one of my favorite ladies from history. I started learning about her 16 years ago when I began working at the Hoover Presidential Library, and quite a woman before her time. And Lou Henry was born in Waterloo, Iowa on March 29, 1874. She was very close to her father, who was a bookkeeper at the First National Bank there, and Lou, for most of her young life, was hoping that she would be able to go in banking as well. And they were extremely close until he passed away in 1928. She had a younger sister, Jean, who was born on June 30th, 1882, and her mother, Florence, developed chronic bronchitis, which caused the family to move around looking for an environment that was more conducive to her mother's health. First, they moved to Shell Rock, Iowa. That didn't work out, and they moved back to Waterloo. Then they tried Corsicana, Texas, and when that didn't work out, they moved back to Waterloo. And then they moved out to Clearwater, Kansas. And when that one didn't work out, instead of coming back to Waterloo, they kept going west until they hit Whittier, California. Her parents moved later to Los Angeles, where Lou began her first academic college career at Los Angeles Normal University, which is today UCLA. And her sophomore year, her parents moved to Monterey. So Lou, after her sophomore year, transferred to San Jose Normal College, which is today San Jose State University. After graduation, Lou sort of tried her love and started working in a bank, and realized quite quickly that women in those days were not going to be allowed to progress or get a very significant job at banks. So she did teach for a little bit, and she was wanted to look for something that she enjoyed even more. And in 1894, she heard a lecture from John Branner on geology, and just like her husband, Herbert Hoover had heard a lecture from the same professor and decided to go to Stanford University. Lou decided to go get a second degree and was the first woman to enter Stanford in the geology department. The two met at Stanford and found they were both from Iowa and both loved to be outdoors as much as possible, and hit it off and became boyfriend and girlfriend. After Lou graduated, Bert asked her to marry him, and they got married at her parents' house in Monterey. And there's a little anecdote from a letter that her mother wrote about this young lad who was marrying their daughter. "We had made up our minds not to like him very well, as he was going to take Lou so far away. But after he had been here a few days, I think we all liked him about as much as Lou did." Yes, he was. They were married on February 10th, 1899, and Actually, the ceremony was started at noon and really was only attended by her sister and parents and Herbert's brother Theodore. And at 2 o'clock, they had to take the train to San Francisco, where they spent their wedding night, and the next morning literally got on a slow boat to China. When her mother mentioned that he was taking their daughter so far away, their honeymoon was going to be in China. They had their first son, Herbert Jr., in 1903, which did not stop her world travels. Actually, they had traveled from London, where they were based at the time, to Australia and spent some time there. But their first Christmas for their firstborn son was in New Zealand. And Lou has a wonderful photograph of her son. And they had no Christmas trees there, so they stole the plant from the hotel and put it in their room and decorated it for Christmas, for his first Christmas. One of the most really interesting stories that I found about Lou was this very interesting trip she took across country in 1921 from California to Washington, D.C. Now, what had happened was her mother had become very ill, and Lou got on the train to go from Washington, D.C. to California to go be with her mother when she was so ill. Unfortunately, her mother passed away before Lou actually arrived in California. As I mentioned, she's very close to her father and was struggling how to help him in this time of grieving after his wife had passed away. And she concocted this story about going across country. A quote from one of the letters that Lou wrote to one of her friends: "He needs change very much, and yet is of course of no humor to get much benefit from a train journey, and none whatever from an ordinary conventional visit. We wanted the California Cadillac in Washington, and I always longed to drive across. So I told him I was going to do that now at the opportune time, and of course he is coming along, so I won't have to be alone. Also a wonderful Filipino boy devoted to him who can drive a car or cook or do any other chores that we balk at. We will likely not reach Washington until the middle of October, perhaps much later, according as weather favors us and we are led by whims of sightseeing delay." So this trip went from September 12th to October 16th, and it was Lou, her father Charles, a nephew, and Matthias is the Filipino servant that she mentioned. The trip ended up 3,945 miles. They consumed 367 gallons of gas, 17 quarts of oil, spent $96.71 on auto repairs, and had 5 punctured tires, 1 accident, 1 engine failure, and 2 repair stops. One of the wonderful things in our archives is a 4-page summary of this journey that her father wrote, sort of noting each day how far they traveled, how much gas they purchased, and perhaps a thought or two about what they came across that day. So there's a number of really interesting entries. Here's one from Wednesday the 14th of September. Leave camp at 9 a.m., Truckee at 3:30 p.m., 8 gallons of gas for $2.40, 2 quarts of oil for 70 cents. They camped at 6:30 p.m., 5 miles from Reno. A 78-mile drive for the day. Mr. Knight, the former principal Agricultural College, now chairman of the Chamber of Commerce, was very willing to give road advice, which we would not have gotten through the canyon without his assistance. So road conditions during this trip could be quite a challenge. There were no highways. That system didn't get started until the Eisenhower administration. Some areas had no roads whatsoever, and it could be a challenge finding the nearest bridge to cross rivers. As they mentioned on the 18th here, for example, They left camp at 7:30 a.m., arrived at the Hotel Meyer in Elko at 4 p.m. At first they had a good gravel road from Carlin to Elko, and they got 78 miles for the day. But then they hit a stretch that was said to be the worst stretch of road between oceans, Battle Mountain to Elko. Total of 10 gallons of gas and 1 quart of oil were used that day. In addition to the road conditions, since repairing the car and having equipment for repairs could be quite a challenge as well. As I mentioned on the 16th, it was a cold morning, left camp at 7:45 a.m., got to Lovelock, got 8 gallons of gas and 1 quart of oil at 8:45 a.m. They passed through Golcando and camped at 6:30 p.m. on the desert after 102 miles of travel on an alkali lake. Mr. Goodwin gave them information regarding roads in the area, and that's where they found fixing wire to repair some trouble they had had with their car. And they seemed to have a stretch of bad luck right when they hit October. On October 1st, they left Henderson at 8:20 a.m. Fort Lupton, 20 gallons of gas for $4.60, elevation 4,906 feet. They stopped at the Hotel Grand Sterling after 138 miles and had punctures in their tires. And the next day, he mentions, they left at 10 a.m., arrived at Palisade at 5:25 to take rooms in a hotel after a 148-mile drive where they had 2 punctures in their tires that day and used up 9 gallons of gas. Another entry from the 19th, they left Elko at 10:15 a.m. They got 5 gallons of gas at Wells. It was fine ranches that they saw during their 17 miles from Elko to Death Wells. Threatening rain with high winds all the way, sprinkling at 4 p.m. and had a punctured tire. Arrived at Coburg, which is a little village with about 8 houses, at 5 p.m. They camped in the railroad station because there was no hotel, 94 miles for the day. One of the interesting stops, there was, and this is a quote from a longer letter from Lou, there's absolutely no place to camp close to this barren little station, and no other nearer than 20 miles. No ranch or hotel or anything. The shack that calls itself a hotel here has only 1 empty single room. But the situation is nice and big, and has just all been beautifully painted inside. So we gave Matthias the hotel room, and we camped in one of the 2 waiting rooms with our own cots and beddings in the railway station. And camping, they brought their own tents and cots, so it was quite a nice if they actually had rooms in a hotel somewhere, but quite often what they would use was their own tents and camping gear they brought with them, including cots, and they would find some scenic area when they were getting ready to stop for the day and set up camp there like people would today. An entry for Thursday the 22nd, they spent the day at Newhouse Hotel in Salt Lake City. J.R. Shaw of Ogden, Utah, RFD 3, number 24319-U21, ran into our car. All are okay. Another entry, Fort Bridger, old trading post. They arrived at 3:30 p.m. Gas was $1.70 for 5 gallons. They camped on the desert. There was no water at all except for what we carried in their canteens for the 121 miles they made that day. On the 27th, they left camp at 9 a.m. A beautiful flat in the mountains. Small canyons with stream flowing through them to the North Platte River. Would like to camp here for months. The flat under the fence, a good stock ranch, covered with cattle in fine condition. At Laramie, the gas, we got 13 gallons and 1 quart of oil for $3.52. They camped near Fort Collins, Colorado, 124 miles for that day. On the 29th, they left at 9 a.m. after a very cold night. Ice this morning in the radiator, no damage done. Wonderful scenery. Altitude 11,800 feet. Crossing the divide, past Vasquez lumber camp, and up the mountains, made a camp at altitude of 9,000 feet, 72 miles that day. On the 30th, they actually crossed the Continental Divide. The coldest morning we had. Told ice forms here every month of the year. We left at 10 a.m. The engine won't start. Oil had congealed. They can't crank or use the self-starter on the car. The sun came out and began warming things up at 11 a.m. Continental Divide, elevation 11,330 feet. The Atlantic side was the Park National Forest, the Pacific side, the Arapahoe National Forest. Denver is 59 miles. Stopped at a hotel at Henderson, a small country tavern, clean rooms and a good summer. 90 miles that day, which gave an 18-day total of 1,648 miles. And then in October, on the 3rd, they left at 8 a.m. 15 gallons of gas cost $3.75. 1 quart of oil, 30 cents. A quick stop for regular spring, or rather to patch the tires to hold till we reached Hastings. We arrived at Holdridge at 5 p.m. after driving 134 miles. And the 11th, they were in Iowa. They left Iowa City at 8:30 a.m., drove out to West Branch, called on one of the Hoover family. Was taken out to his house, met his wife and mother, drove around and shown different farms and points of interest, arriving at the house in which Bert was born. 8 gallons of gas was $1.96. Arrived at Dixon, Illinois at 6 p.m. and drove 154 miles that day. Now, Lou had thought that this trip would be extremely educational for their son Herbert Jr., and she had hoped to take him along, almost as a form of homeschooling in those days. And she wrote in a letter to her son, "It always pays, I think, to tell people, especially your mother, the real truth about everything. If I'd not fortunately known that you had your fill of long automobile journeys for a few years, I fear I should have felt there was more educational value to be got out of a transcontinental trip than out of 6 weeks of school, and then you would have been in for it." So this trip was her way to spend quality time with her father as they are both grieving the passing of her mother. Along the way, although they don't lead a lot of written record of it, they visited with various family members of the Henry family and the Hoover family along the way, and this seemed to really be of assistance in her father coping with his new situation. Thanks for watching my discussion of Lou Henry Hoover's trip. Be sure to tune in for next month's Third Thursday presentation. If you have any questions at all about what I talked about today or Lou Henry Hoover in general, feel free to leave a comment on the Facebook page and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Also, if you would like a copy of the PowerPoint presentation or the document I was reading from that was created by Charles Henry that describes the trip, I'd be happy to email you copies of either of those. So thanks again for your time and have yourself a fine day and be safe.